Okay, welcome everyone. I think some other people may come in, but I want to start so we don't use up all our time. I want to welcome everyone to the second part of a three-session mini course with Professor Anita Norwich on women in Yiddish literature. I introduced Professor Norwich last week, so I'll make it very brief this week, which is that Professor Anita Norwich is the Tikva Firmer-Kensky Collegiate Professor Emerita of English and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. And her most recent book is A Jewish Refugee in New York, published in 2019, which was a translation of a Yiddish novel by Kadia Molodovsky. And Professor Norwich is a very active translator and has a book coming out soon, and has been a major figure in thinking about Yiddish literature, modern Jewish literature, and the significance of translation. We are in a webinar format, as you all know, because you're so used to this by now, so you are muted. But if you have any questions during the session, please put them in the chat, and I will then pose them to Professor Norwich. She will be stopping roughly 20 minutes or something into this session tonight to give you time to digest the material that's being offered. And that will allow you to ask questions, in mitten, as it were, and not only at the end. So please take advantage of her expertise and be present now to ask those questions. The mini course is being recorded and will be available on the Bildner Center website in a few days. So I want to welcome all of you again, and I want to thank in particular the staff of the Bildner Center. And tonight we have behind the scenes Gabriel Duke, who's been instrumental and indispensable in making tonight happen. So thank you so much, Gabriel. Okay, I'm going to say goodbye and just mention one last thing, is that without the generosity of the Sagner Family Foundation, this mini course would not be happening. And we're deeply, deeply grateful for its support and for all the support that you give us to run the programs we run. Okay, Professor Norwich, you are on.
Thank you so much. And I really want to thank the staff as well. And Gabriel has saved me from many a really bad computer mistake, including one tonight, where I almost couldn't get on. But I am here, happily. I want to talk, what I like most doing is reading texts and explicating them and hearing what people think of them. I want in particular to talk about three writers today, but also to continue the conversation that we began last time about some of the different ways in which male writing and female writing has been considered within Yiddish criticism, and the ways in which it has been translated. You'll remember that last time we began talking about the way in which the language of Yiddish is coded as mamaloshen, as feminine, and the literature of Yiddish is coded as masculine. And the entrance of women into that milieu caused, let's say calmly, some consternation among some Yiddish writers. It's also important to note that women were considered writers, as I believe I said last time, were considered to be writers of poetry, which was the more appropriate genre for women, according to many of the critics, and not necessarily long prose works. And the question of why that is so, why they were so considered, or why they really did write more in America, certainly in poetry than in prose, is a question that's worth asking. It's worth considering. I don't know that there's a definitive answer to it, but there are several answers. One of the answers that's often been given that is, I think, the wrong answer, is that women could write poems. I'm going to say this rather sarcastically. I don't mean it only sarcastically, but one of the reasons that they prospered more in poetry, goes the explanation, is that poetry you can write in more quickly, which is, of course, as any poet will say, absurd. And the expansive form of the novel requires the kind of time and publishing resources that were rarely available to women. I think of this again as the kind of Emily Dickinson school of criticism, right? That is the idea that you can write a poem and then stick a line of it into your apron and keep going. That is certainly not the experience of any of the either novelists, although we're not reading the novel together, but they are there, novelists or short stories or poems. It is true that the greatest experiments in literature, the greatest advancements in modern literature in the United States took place in poetry for men and for women. That's not true of Eastern Europe. And again, it's worth considering that distinction. Why in poetry? Why not not that there aren't novels in American Yiddish writing, obviously there are, but why that particular focus? One of the answers to that, I think, is that prose, novels and stories, particularly novels, carry with them an expectation within Yiddish, certainly, and more broadly, I think, of social analysis, of a broader social, cultural, maybe political and economic perspective. And long prose writing also, because of this social criticism aspect of it, also conveyed a kind of intellectual authority. And if you would think for just a moment of the combination of the words or the embeddedness of the words author, authorship, and authority, I think you'll see how that connection comes to be underscored. That is, authorship conveys a kind of cultural authority that women were not considered to have had in the same way. And there are obvious differences between the social exposure of men and women, not just what I said last time about men saying, telling stories, zwischen Minchen Meirev, between prayers, and women just talking too much. It's not only that, but men and women studied differently. Women, of course, didn't go to yeshiva, not that all of the Yiddish male writers did, but they had an expected and realized Jewish education that was not always available to women. On the other hand, women knew European cultures in a much broader way. The question of authority, religious authority is always cast in this context in masculine terms. That is, religious authority belongs to men, kitchen authority belongs to women. And again, large quotation marks around that. We don't see this in the stories or the poems that we're reading here, but another, I think, really interesting observation about Jewish literature is that the image of, the overbearing Jewish mother, the one that we hope we've all gotten past, but that is deeply embedded in popular culture. That's really an American phenomenon. You don't find that same image in either Yiddish or in Hebrew. And there again, it's worth asking why. And again, a lot of the answer is socio-critical. That is, when men had certain expectations of a kind of success in America, what America demanded, that women, when they entered into the same workforce, challenged in ways that were problematic. The status that mattered in Eastern Europe was learning, religious learning. The status that mattered in America was economic. And in both of those, women were at a disadvantage for I think, obvious reasons. So what did these women make of these differences? And obviously one of the things that they made was literature. I can't seem to share my screen. I've been having trouble with this. Somebody is sharing the screen.
We will have Gabriel share the screen, and you'll be able to see it. We'll do it that way.
Okay.
Just let me know when to change slides.
Okay, just put up the first slide, please. I can't see it.
Just one moment, please. I'll let you know when it is up.
No, that's fine. Sorry, folks. While we're the challenge of technology, I just want to say one other thing to sort of that will come up again and again in this discussion, which is that a lot of the women, the writers that we're talking about, were at various points, including Friedel-Stock, who's the first one we will consider. There we go. There's Friedel-Stock. Were considered, were believed to be mad women, basically, insane. And what we get again and again is a sense that when women seek to transcend the limitations of their worlds, they resort or are considered to resort to madness. When men do that, when men seek to get out of the confines of the confines of their world, they resort to mysticism, and I think that difference is quite telling. Friedel-Stock is one of those writers who was considered to have been a mad woman. There's a typo on the death date, somebody just told me. Well, that's interesting. Okay, somebody will explain that in a moment. Let me stick to this. Friedel-Stock came from Ukraine, and she immigrated to the US in 1907. And she began participating in a group of writers who were primarily male writers, but certainly not exclusively so, a group called the Junge, the Youth, which was a modernist movement that argued for individual expression, individual aesthetic, artistic expression, rather than the political concerns of the Jewish masses. There's a catchy little title, not title, a catchy sentence about this, that one of the members of the Junge, one of the adherents to the Junge, Zisha Landau, said that before the Youth, before the Junge came onto the scene, Yiddish poetry was, and I quote, the rhyming department of the Jewish labor movement, which is about as much of a put down as you can get from a poet. Stock began publishing her first poems in 1910, and she published short stories beginning in 1916. She also published one novel that she is said to have translated herself, a novel called Musicians Only, although there is some question about what kind of help she got in that translation. And it was, I'll just say honestly, it's not a good novel, and it fell quite flat. There is a new collection. You can't see my screen. Or me. Okay, there's a new collection.
We can see it. We can see it. You can hold it up.
Oh, yeah. Okay. That has just come out. I'm actually not sure if it's out or if I have an advanced copy. And it's called From the Jewish Provinces, Selected Stories of Friedel-Stock, which are very, very good translations of her stories. So here are the whole series of rumors that circulated around Friedel-Stock. She published her first collection of poems in 1919, and it got, shall we say, mixed reviews. One of the reviews was by another poet of the Junge, Arenglans Laelis, who really panned it quite strongly. And the rumor is that after this negative review, which he published in the publication that he was working for, Der Tag, the newspaper, that after this negative review, she flounced into, this is a very dramatic women's movement, I suppose. She flounced into the offices of Der Tag, and she slapped Laelis and walked out. Not at all clear whether this is true or not. Laelis had written a few years earlier, in 1915, he had written an essay called Kultur und die Frau, Culture and Women, that argued that since women were naturally more intuitive and naturally more emotional than men, they would naturally is always a loaded term, they would naturally write differently. And they would give another side to Yiddish literature and perhaps soften some of the extremities of Yiddish male writing, that is the critique in Yiddish male writing. This is, of course, not a criticism that Friedel Stock would have been interested in. The other rumor is, as it says in the chat, that she, and it is a rumor and it has been disproven quite clearly. The rumor was that she died in a mental hospital around 1930, which is not true. Oh, why do I have 1850? That's just ridiculous. Okay, forget this date altogether. In fact, I don't know where I took this date from. I apologize for this, which I no longer can change. It's not even 1952 that she died at a quite advanced age, according to the new research that was done for this book by Jordan Finken and Alison Schachter, probably in 1990. She was institutionalized for the last almost 25 years of her life. But she did, there are publications that appeared in 1942 after she was supposed to be dead. She sent a story to the Fauverts. There's a play manuscript that she wrote as well. That is, the rumor that she stopped writing because of negative reviews in 1919 is simply not true. There's another rumor that she introduced the sonnet form to Yiddish poetry, which is also not quite true. She didn't introduce it. She certainly used it, but she didn't introduce it. And the question is really not why did everybody, well, yeah, no, the question is why were these rumors believed for such a long time? And the most direct answer is because they fit into the way in which women writers were thought of. That is, a little mad. Sometimes they were considered too passionate to live and therefore were suicidal, which is not something that Friedel Stock was accused of having been, and that they wrote poetry, so that her stories, one of which, of course, I've given you, are ignored. And even the appreciative reviews of her work, and a lot of it was well received, but even the appreciative reviews were largely rather patronizing, right? They ignored what was one of her chief themes, and which you'll see as a theme in each of the writers that we're reading together today. One of the things that were ignored, overlooked, were her treatments of erotic desires, of sexuality, of the the rebellion not only against the strictures of traditional Judaism, but against the repression that is physically imposed upon women in Jewish life. The Veil, which is the story that I hope you read, I'm going to assume you read. The Veil is an interesting expression of a lot of this. The first thing that I want to point out about it, that I will also suggest about everything that we're reading, is that none of that we're reading symbolic. We're reading metaphor and not allegory. I want to make a clear distinction between those. That is, again, in the same way that I said last time, women's literature is often considered to be autobiographical because, and my objection to that is that it takes away the imaginative power. Women's literature is also considered often to be allegorical. That is, it tells a story of, it tells a story, and it has a moral at the end of it, as opposed to opening the possibility for numerous interpretations, which all of the things that we're reading together, I think, do allow. So, see, this is where I wish I could see everyone and we could have a real conversation, but that is not possible here. So I'm resorting to a kind of speech again. So the veil as a symbol. What is the veil a symbol of? And there's more than one answer because it's not an allegory. It's a symbol of marriage, right? You lift the veil and you are married. Do you lift the veil into sexual awakening, into the normalcy of family life? But in any case, it signals marriage. But it also signals, of course, hiding, right? You hide, your identity is hidden behind that veil. It needs to be lifted in the course of the wedding. It's a sign of modesty. And in this story, there are two other important images that come out, that thread through the story. One is klezmer, musicians, and klezmarim play a crucial role, not only in this story, but in the Jewish literary imagination. Some of you may know Shalom Aleichem's, what's called Shalom Aleichem's first novel, although it's not his first, Stempenu, which is about a klezmer. And the image of the klezmer there and here is interesting, I think. It is somebody who is important to the ritual life of the community, which is to say, they play at weddings. You can't really put on a wedding without klezmorim accompanying the bride and groom. I mean, you can religiously, but they're needed at a wedding. And they're also, while central to that ritual life, they're also outside of it. They travel around from town to town. They always come with this appearance of mystery, otherness, not quite bound by the laws. And here too, in this story, it's the klezmer who wants something more from her, who talks about her physical appearance, who wants to get closer to her. There is an erotic charge there, always in the klezmer. And there's a line in the story where it says where Stock says that the klezmer music had, and I quote, buried more than one Jewish bride. That is, by accompanying her to this marriage, it's a kind of death, of murder. But again, it's the klezmer who whispers words of passion, I would call them. So, what we have here is a kind of Cinderella-like story, right? She needs a dress in order to go, but this is a Cinderella story with out the happy ending, right? That is, the shoe won't fit here. If there were a shoe, what fits her, and I think that this is deliberate. I don't think this is an accidental allusion to the Cinderella story. What is put on her, rather than the magical shoe, is that coat at the end. Can you switch to the next slide, please? Yeah. So this is the last paragraph. This is the last paragraph of the story. And the question is, what's happening in this last paragraph? She stood there in a daze, not knowing what was happening to her. As the music played, it seemed so alien to her, so distant. All at once, a gray sheepskin coat appeared, a man's coat, and Manya put her arms into it, letting her mother wrap it around her neck. And it seemed to her that the worst part was her mother wrapping it around her neck. So on the one hand, we have this image of really a noose. You know, it's being wrapped around her neck. Is it the noose of tradition? Is it the noose of the expectations of women? It's the noose that will not literally let her breathe. And there's another element in it, which I think is a question that the story poses at the end, which is the extent to which women themselves are complicit. Right? It is, after all, her mother who wraps it around her neck, right? It is her mother who keeps her, or seeks to keep her modestly, in modesty. And that's a question that she doesn't answer explicitly. That is, to what extent are women complicit in this choking, in this strangling, in this inability, unwillingness perhaps to let women breathe, even their own daughters. All right, I'm going to stop here and see if there are any questions. And I also just want to say that I can't see myself here, so I don't know if I'm in the picture at all.
No, we can see you.
And how's my head? Okay. All right.
Yeah, it's fine.
I see you, but that's it. Okay.
No, we see you with no problem. And we could hear you with no problem. So someone just made a comment that it's similar to, she's being strangled at the end, and it's similar to Chinese foot binding. I think what's very interesting in your last comment is that not all, but there is a tradition within female writing of criticizing their fathers, right? You know, the patriarchy. And you're raising another question about to what degree are, you know, there's in thinking about women's roles in traditional Judaism, there's a in the system when it works, as it were, the women are enablers, right? The women enable the tradition to go forward in the vein where the men are study and learned and play the public roles, and women provide the support. And that has been seen for many generations and still today as important to keep the system going. And what you have here is a different kind of critique, where the daughter, if you will, is pointing a finger at the mother. You too, you know, and you think of what it's like for the bride to get her hair cut if that's what happens. You know, her mother says, you need to do this. All the generations before you have done this. You need to do it too. So that, I guess what I'm wondering is, can you elaborate on that? And also, do we have other examples that come to mind besides this story from Fredel Stock?
This is a sign that we didn't plan this in advance, because the question threw me a little bit. So here's the problem. The entrance and entering into modernity is considered rebellious, and it's men who do the rebellion in the literature. So that when women are rebelling, as she clearly is against this veil, remember there's a scene where she looks under the veil of the bride and sees beauty there, but it's hidden all that she has seen is hidden. So there are other stories where, and obviously other works where it is the woman who is rebelling against, but there are also it's not only men, it's not only the patriarchal tradition that resist that. I mean, I'm thinking of a work that is not Yiddish work, but written by someone who also wrote Yiddish, a work I'm sure many of you know, Anzi Yezierska's Bread Givers, right? That is an attack on the father, on patriarchy. But look at the mother. That's, you know, she's not encouraging this moving into the new world by any means. She's kind of a pathetic figure. And we have this again and again and again, right? If women are entering into the modern world, then they're doing it at the expense of men, as you've been describing, right? They're doing it at the expense of supporting the men who should be out there in the world, sticking it out, setting out for themselves. Another really good example here, I think, is somebody we'll read next time. The Singer sister, Esther Singer Keitman, right? The boys, well, the boys, the male writers in that family were considered out in the world. And her entry, Esther Singer Keitman's entry into the wider world, was considered rebellious both by her mother and by her father for different reasons. So this isn't a straightforward, you know, it's not patriarchy sucks. Patriarchy does, but it's not only the men who will resist this rebelliousness.
Someone in the chat mentions that it looks familiar as echoes the story by Sholem Asch, right? So it's not merely that, right. And the cutting of the hair is obviously such a profound symbol. And many other traditions have this too. You know, daughters, you know, who turn to their mother and say, "Why, in essence, why are you sacrificing me?" Right.
Yeah.
So okay, I don't know if we have any other questions. So unless you have other observations up.
Veil's described as beautiful.
Well, now this has always happened. Just say we got to move on, and then the questions come in. So we have the veil is described as beautiful. It may be a thing of beauty as well as a metaphor for concealment. Sure.
Yes.
And
that's actually a very good point, and it underscores what I was trying to say about metaphor and not allegory, right? That it can go in multiple directions.
And then we have another comment by Hinda Inna that Friedel Stock's story Abgeschnittene Haar, right, the shorn head, right, addresses rebellion with respect to the requirement that you. Nice.
Sorry.
No. I just want to read it. Not everyone is reading on a screen. Some people may be listening, so I want them to be able to see.
But that Friedel Stock story about women cutting their hair is like the Sholem Asch one, about a woman objecting to cutting her hair when she becomes a bride. That is, it's again and again, we're reminded that it's not that men do X and women do Y. You know, this isn't like the chromosomes. There's a lot of mixing and going back and forth. We will not find one voice, which people keep looking for, one voice in these women, right? Just as we don't find them in the men. There's a range, quite a wide range.
Right.
Okay, I think I'd better
go ahead.
Go on.
Sure, please.
Okay, so
Gabriel, do you need Gabriel to put something up for you? Yeah.
Next screen, please. So this is it's a wonderful picture of Malka Heifetz Tussman, I think, who is also from Ukraine. And you know, there's almost a biography you can write about Yiddish writers that has many of the same words in that biography. That is, they were all multilingual. I'm going to let that sink in for a moment. They were all multilingual, whether in Hebrew or in European languages. Almost all of them wrote in other languages as well. Tussman, in particular, wrote in Russian. and in Yiddish, of course. And she came to the U.S. in 1912. She went to Israel for a year, but mostly she was here. There are 2 volumes of poetry that I particularly love the titles of, and I took one poem from each of them. The first one, which appeared in a volume in 1965 called Schattens von Gedenken, Shadows of Remembering or of Remembrance. It's a wonderful title. And in that poem, in that collection, we have a poem, you can go to the next slide, called Wasser on Loschen. Let me read it in Yiddish so that you hear the cadence of it, the free verse cadence of it. And you can follow it in the English. Der Jan hat von sein Seit a Ripper rausgerissen und gesagt, geh, leg sich dorten, sei mir a Simen, als ich bin groß, mächtig bin ich, geh, sei mir a Simen. Liegt der Kanal bei meinem Fenster stumm, was kann noch teuriger sein, wie Wasser on Loschen? So Loschen is the first, I mean, as Professor Sinkoff said, I'm obsessed by translation now for many years, but certainly these days as well. And the focus is on that word Loschen, which means, which really means speech, right? Or language. In Hebrew, it means tongue. So it's water without, water makes sense, you know, it doesn't make as much sense, water without speech, but it's water without sound. That is, nothing comes out from this. Now, again, on the one hand, this is clearly an allusion to the story of Adam and Eve, right? The seed tore a rib from its side. Eve is the rib, Eve is the woman. The woman is told, the rib is told, to go lie down there and be a sign that I am great and mighty. Go and be a sign. And this is the worst that can be imagined. That is, that you are not anything but a sign of something else. There's no, I guess my students would say there's no there, but there is only this being a sign for something else. And the sign is that the man is great, right? But then we have this very, I think, peculiar, well, they're all, this very provocative, peculiar ending. The canal lies at my window, speechless, stumm, silent, literally silent. The canal lies at my window, silent. What can be sadder than water without loschen, water without a language, water without speech, water without sound? When does water not have any sound? I mean, we say, you know, it's an image that Tussman would certainly have known and might even be reflecting on, but it's one that I can't escape from here, which is, we say in English, still waters run deep, right? So either we have a situation where, I don't know when water is ever silent, it's flowing, it's, you know, I keep thinking of the ocean or the waves. So that's one problem, that water isn't really without sound. You just have to listen, which is partly what is being said here about women. You just have to listen. They are not silent. We are not speechless, right? So that's one. And the other is still waters run deep. What's beneath those waters? What do those waters contain? And if you want to substitute here the word women for waters, go right ahead. I want to do that too, right? What does it contain? What is that, what you think of as silent? if it runs deep, what's there at the depth? And that's really a question that Tussman is asking. That is, don't make me a sign. Don't make me into a sign of something that you think I should represent. If you go to the next one, please. In 1974, she published another volume of poems. This time published, that came out in Israel, that was called Unter dein Zeichen, under your sign. Again, this question of, well, we call it semiotics, right? The sign system and what those signs signify, what do these words signify, is central to her. And this one, well, can you go to the next screen for a moment, please? And then we'll switch back. Okay, so this begins in Yiddish. I only gave you the beginning in Yiddish and two translations of it, of that beginning. Tu epis mit mem in almone, soll nicht sein wie a juk wie a muk. Okay, so both of these translators, Marcia Falk and Catherine Hellerstein, translate this obviously correctly as do something to, well, look at the mem. If you can you see my arrow, Nancy? Well, all right. In the
wait. Just tell me where you want the arrow. Tell me where you want the arrow to be.
Under the mem. Under the mem. All right, never mind. In the third line, there in the Yiddish, there is a letter in the middle that most of you, I think, will recognize as mem, right? And this says, do something with the mem, with that letter M in the word widow, almone, so that it doesn't crawl over my skin, right? You know, the mem, which when you write it looks like a capital N, will keep moving, right? It seems to move infinitely in this kind of crawling way. But the mem also is the first letter of the word mavet, which means death, right? So what do you know about this almona? What do you know about this widow? You know her connection to death, and that is all you know. That's all you're willing to know, is the accusation, I think, here, right? I actually love the way that they both pick up the W, which has the same kind of crawling motion, right? And where in Yiddish it says, es kriecht über mein Haut und grabbelt teut. You can hear the rhyme there. It crawls over my skin and scratches death, right? You might have translated this, I mean, I think that they made absolutely the right choice. But if we had gone with a similar kind of movement as we have in the Almone, you might have said, do something with the D in widow that scratches death. It would have underscored that connection. But, you know, these are editorial questions, not definitive answers. Can you go back to the one above, please? To the all English one? Okay. So listen to what is being asked here. Do something to the W in widow so it won't be like a spider that crawls on my flesh, scratching death, scratching death. Do something to the W. Illumined within myself, luxuriating in my warmth, I am a column of sun. This is very different from the mem in Almona, from the widow. And he bent down low over me. And here are the, I think, crucial lines here. I looked up and softly said, my name is desire. This is the widow speaking. Is yours passion? And he, no, my name is compassion, which kills desire, which kills passion, right? And he blew on my glow and put me out. And then there's this quiet cheek, this gentle touch, and he whispered this is in her imagination, her dead husband, like a quiet prayer, wife, sad wife. He had wanted to calm, and this, of course, says he did exactly the opposite, right? He'd wanted to calm, he'd meant to soothe the wailing of my flesh. But what's the problem here? He's not listening. The problem is that, no, really, the problem is that we hear a word, and I think, you can substitute many words here, including the word Yiddish, and the word woman, and the word poetry. Right? You hear the word, and you have certain associations with it that make it difficult to see past those associations to what the word may actually contain, right? I say Jewish mother, I said Jewish mother a little while ago. We all have these images from really bad literature and terrible jokes, right? But see past that. You hear the word Yiddish, and you have certain associations with it without actually listening. I mean, this is the plight of Yiddish women writers. You say Yiddish women writers, and one hears poems, sentimental, emotional, rather than looking at what's there. And the desire here is very clear, and it's physical. It's a sensual desire, and you don't respond to it by patting this woman on the head, figuratively, and saying, I feel for you. You're not listening, is what this is saying again and again. If you do this, if you reply with compassion to something else, it's a kind of condescension. You're condescending to someone who is saying very clearly what she wants. And that condescension is oppressive, literally oppressive. So I'm very much taken by this, with this poem. Okay, I don't know if I should stop for questions here or if I can keep going.
I have a quick
Nancy.
question. I have a just quick question. Starting to put myself back on here for a second. Yeah, I have a question. I mean, you might not be able to answer this because it may be. In what part of her life did she write this poem? Was this a projection of widowhood, or was it when she was older?
No, she she wrote this after her husband died, but her husband had died 30 years earlier, right? So it wasn't in response to any of that. And she was, by the time she was writing this, she was in, she was not a young woman anymore, let's just say. She wasn't old, but by standards that I now hold, but she wasn't a young woman.
The other thing I'd like to notice, no one else has said, there's nothing else in the chat, but maybe this will stimulate it. And again, I'm not looking at the second column in the Yiddish. And so the choice between beetle and spider, but this idea, the image, he opened up his large square mouth. I thought he was going to bite her, right? Yeah, before you get and blew on my glow. So,
well, that's what happens when you don't listen. You that's the oppression. That's the over. You have this image of somebody standing over, breathing into. Right? There's a comment in the chat that says, I read it as the man saying that as a widow, you have no business, no right to have desire. That's exactly the point.
That's exactly right. Right.
That's exactly right. Right. Because I know what you should be feeling as a widow.
Right. You should miss me and not have desire. Right.
And what does it mean to have desire after my death? Right.
Right.
And she's really, in both of these poems, she's saying, don't be fooled by the sign, by the word widow, by the word lashon, sound, silence, speech, language. Listen to it first, or listen to it only. All right, and zipping right along, if you can go down 2, please. We come to one of the most, I think, one of the most controversial poets and prose writers that have been more recently considered within the Yiddish literary canon. And controversial because her writing is clearly, inescapably also erotic. And that made people, critics, rather uncomfortable. I'm now translating a novel that she wrote, the only novel that she wrote that appeared in 1934 in the forwards, but her poetry was very well reviewed and received, despite its explicit sexual imagery, except by those critics who objected to it strongly in words that I'd like to quote, because they're, it's a fascinating sort of cultural study. So there's a well-known Argentinian critic named Yankiv Botashansky who said she did not, Dropkin did not touch on any world problems. She did not bring forth any of her own unique thoughts. This is what women were always accused of. They were borrowing from men, or they were adopting from. She sang her song from her body, from her longing for love, for flowers, for play, for death. I don't even know, how many ways to criticize this, right? She didn't touch on any world problems. What does that mean? There's another one by a critic named Rifkin who wrote, "She has talent, yay, but even her illusions can't get away from her body. Her body won't let up." That's what women are always tied to, their bodies. Nige, perhaps the most famous, the most well-known American Yiddish critic, called her writing oppressively personal. Poetry of the head is not for her, she's a heart poem. Her poems reflect a purely personal memory. This is the same objection. I mean, I would object to this in the same way that I objected to reading women's literature as autobiographical, right? It's a purely personal memory. It's a private thing. He goes on to say it's stuff for an album. It is not lyric. So there's a comment that just came up that I saw. She didn't say anything original, and she sang the song of her body. Sound like completely contradictory statements. Not for the, yes, I understand why you're saying that, Sophia, but for these critics, it's the same thing. That is, she's not saying anything original. She's not saying anything creative is what this means. She's simply expressing what her body contains. Again, it's all in the body, nothing's in the head. Yankiv Gluckstein, who's one of my favorite poets, unfortunately thought that her work was, and I quote, uninhibited diary jottings. It's probably the dumbest thing he ever wrote, because he was a brilliant poet and critic. So what's going on in this poem, if you go to the next one, The Acrobat? Can you make that a whole lot bigger? So the The Acrobat is one possible translation of this. It has also been translated as the circus dancer, or as the circus lady, which is the most literal one. The Circus Dame is the most literal, is the Yiddish version. This is a disturbing poem. I'm an acrobat. I'm just going to read it in English, unless you have questions about the Yiddish later. I'm an acrobat. I just lost. We've gone offline.
No, Gabriel is going to try to make it bigger.
Oh, forget it. I don't need it to be bigger. I can see it.
Okay.
Welcome to technology. I just let
Gabriel, can you try and bring it back up? There we
just
go.
bring it back. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I am an acrobat, and I dance between daggers erected in the ring, tips up. If this strikes you as a subtle image, read it again. My lithe body, barely touching the blades, eludes death by falling. They hold their breath when they watch me dance, and there is always someone praying for me. The tips shine in a fiery circle. No one knows how much I'd like to slip. I'm tired of dancing between you, cold steel daggers. I want my blood warming your bare tips to fall. Okay, so this really does seem to me like a very clearly erotically charged poem, right? I want to. I'm dancing between daggers, tips up. You know, sometimes a pen is not just a pen. They watch me dance, the tips shine in a fiery circle. But what is the desire for here, right? No one knows how much I'd like to slip. I'm tired of dancing between you, cold steel daggers. I want to fall on your bare tips. So is this a desire for death? Is it a desire for sex? You know, almost despite herself? Is it? Well, it is this. What we have here really is that sort of classical combination of eros and thanatos, of a desire for the erotic and an urge to aggression and death, right? It's not just a claim to, well, let me start again. One of the ways in which this has been understood is as a response to the critics who didn't like her work, right? Here I have been, I'm an acrobat. I've got to do all sorts of contortions in order to get myself between the pages that you control. I'm doing this a little dramatically, but not overly dramatically, I think. And it expresses both that desire. It expresses both that knowledge of the danger of doing what she's doing, writing poetry, dancing like an acrobat, insisting on being in the literary world, on the one hand, and the inevitability for the poet of that kind of desire, that combination. So that it's not so much oppressively personal, but accusatory as well. That is, if I'm going to get out there in public and do the contortions that I do, I may not be well received. And you know what? I'm willing to go with that. That closeness of a death wish and an erotic wish at the end, that closeness of eros and thanatos, I think, is very typical of much of her writing. Okay, I'm going to stop there and perhaps turn to questions if you can get me back on some screen.
Yeah, there you are. I have a question. You've talked a lot about the reception or criticism of the male literary intelligentsia. To what degree did other women writers, Yiddish writers, respond to each other's work?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you for that question. We know much less about that than we should. That is, and there's a lot of work being done on this now. The letters that women wrote to one another,
right.
They're wonderful bodies of letter. I mean, the archives are full of these letters of, you know, women saying to other women, "You're singing in my voice. I finally have found something in Yiddish poetry or in Yiddish letters that sings in me too. You know, the Yiddish literary world was never a warm and fuzzy place. Right? There's a lot of, you know, this one doesn't know what he's saying, that one doesn't know what he's doing, this one can't write. And there was a little of that among the women too, but actually I'm struck by how much less of it there was. I think that they were so struggling to create some sense of community, some sense of being in, you know, the larger literary world, that that it led to them being more willing to express appreciation for one another's writings.
Yeah, I think that that speaks to larger challenge for literary historians and historians in general. You know, if you're only looking at published journals where there's already a self-selected cadre of people who are allowed to opine, right? You know, if you know, then you're not going to find the women's voices. So you have to actually look at these quote private documents, you know, and letters. We always know epistles are always important. At still time, you know, even emails today, right? That's the problem. We're not going to have our collective emails. Someone may have them, Big Brother, but the epistle
they also published one another. I mean, to the extent that some of them were in a position to publish.
What's an example of that? What's an example of that?
Rachel Auerbach, who was and as well eventually, I mean, she was in the Vilna Partisans, and eventually
and a major figure in Einik Shabbos, right?
You know, Einik Shabbos, exactly.
Right. And disregarded for most of her life.
And disregarded for most of her life, but not lately. I mean,
not lately. Yeah. She's been redeemed a little bit lately.
And Kaja Molodowski edited a journal and published other women as well. I mean, men published women also. I don't want to suggest that this was some women's, you know, that this was a women's section only.
So I'm going to ask the audience if you have any questions. Again, there's a lot in small texts, a lot to think about. Please don't hesitate. And you know, if you have questions when we go off and you want to think about them for next week, just don't forget, you know, we're Professor Norwich is eager to hear what you have to say. She's, I know, very deeply frustrated this is webinar form. So
I think I've said this one too many times to you, and I apologize.
That's right.
But you know, I'm also on email rather compulsively.
So
I'm happy to answer questions there.
Well, I have another question though about, so Celia and Fiddlestock and our second poet, what these are East European immigrants who come to the United States, correct?
Yes. Not in the wait, yes.
So again, any sense of the transnational acceptance or not of their work?
Okay,
outside?
So that's very interesting also, because up until the Second World War, things were published on both continents and were widely reviewed on both continents.
Right.
I mean, when I say published on both continents, this is sometimes would fall, if we have lawyers among us, under the category of plagiarism, or not plagiarism, copyright infringement.
Copyright violation, right.
Copyright violation. Although there is an interesting story about plagiarism with Dropkin. Dropkin had some kind of either probably unconsummated relationship with the Hebrew writer Uri Gnessine.
No.
And Gnessine took one of her poems, her early poems, from Russian, translated it into Hebrew, included it in his novel without attribution. That's all I'm going to say about that.
Okay.
But yeah, the circulation of this material really was, it's not just that they were published in both places, but when I refer to them as I often do, as cosmopolitan, as internationalists. It's because they were international.
Totally.
I mean,
Totally.
they were cosmopolitans. They were internationalists. They traveled. They were multilingual. That's the one that, you know, as a writer, as a translator, I'm most fascinated by. That,
Well, it
you
can
know,
trip you up because they may have. Anyway, that's another story. But yes, of course. Look, this is true, very, very true of Yiddish, right? That wherever East European Jews lived, even in the original place or when they
Yeah.
migrated someplace else, they are inherently transnational. The language is inherently transnational. Their communities are inherently transnational. We all know that who work on this material. You find stuff from South Africa, you find stuff from Winnipeg, you find stuff from Warsaw, you find stuff from Ukraine, and you find stuff from Buenos Aires and Mexico City. And it's just, there's a home in the language, but it's transnational. Okay, so now we have a billion questions. Well, not billion, but 4. So I'm going to just read them, and you don't necessarily have to answer them, but I just want to make sure that some of our students or audience who are not on a screen may not be able to read them. So someone asked that they're curious about your selections move from depicting women in old age to a young girl to a baby. So you're the developmental arc, they're wondering if that's deliberate. Just hold that. Someone
God, I wish it were. That would have been so clever.
Well, just claim it. Yes,
I'm going to claim it. I got it.
Ontology and phylogeny. And
Right.
someone else is telling people that Dropkin did an interview with the Yiddish Book Center, and if you could probably YouTube it. Dropkin.
Her relatives did interviews.
Oh, the daughters-in-law. So
and
yes,
nieces. I'm not sure if she did one. And
it's relatives. Yeah, that's what it says. I can look for it later. And then
she did not die at 102. Where is that from?
That we're having a lot of death. We're having a lot of death doubt around here today. I'm going to leave that there. But here's a wonderful question. So, did they write poetry or prose in other languages?
Yes. That's another thing. Ruth died at 102, not Celia. Okay. That makes sense. Yes, I mean, that's what I was saying. Dropkin started out as a Russian writer. Look, this is the story of the Enlightenment in Yiddish literature in general, right? Writers started out in another language, often men or women. Now, it's true that the male writers tended to start off in Hebrew,
right?
Peretz in Polish, but also Hebrew. And the women writers tended to start off in European languages, right. German, Russian.
Okay, I'm going to just
Sorry.
I was just going to close off because your time is valuable. But I want to say to everyone, the question of language, what language you write in, is critical, right? Because it changes your audience.
Yeah. I'm going to add 1 or 2 things to next week's reading so that I can talk even faster. So if you would look out for those before next week, that would be great.
Great. So I want to
thank you for listening.
I want to thank Professor Norwich, and I want to tell everyone that, we're still in Zoom, and so sometimes there are technological things that are beyond our control, like updates and things like this, that the gremlins just attack you and you just have to cope. So thank you for your patience. I want to remind you that next week is our last session for this particular class. And then next week, I'll tell you about everything we're doing in the spring. But for this class on Yiddish and Women in Literature, we only have 1 more session. Unfortunately, malheureusement, niestete, chaval, all the languages. And I want to remind everyone also that this Thursday, we have an in-person event, which is just shocking to think that we're doing this. It's extraordinary. And I really hope that you, if you're in New Jersey and can get to us, I look forward to seeing you and greeting you. Leah Garrett, who is a professor of English literature and Yiddish literature at Hunter College, will be speaking about her new book, Ex-Troop, The Secret Jewish Commandos of World War II. She's a great speaker. It's going to be a wonderful event, and I look forward to seeing you. So until Monday next,
thank you.
See you soon. Bye. Thank you so much, Dr. Norwich.
Thank you.